It's fun to see people.
Mhm.
Mark.
Um, and usually people are joining for the first 5 to 15 minutes. So we'll get started and they can always catch up with the first few minutes. We are going to get started. Welcome all. My name is Serene. Welcome to the February Meet the Faculty Speaker Series. My camera is off because of internet issues, but I'm so glad you're here for this talk with Richard about his research. Kat, to your question in the to the chat, cameras on, cameras off. It's whatever you're comfortable with. In these pandemic times, I don't judge what people's decisions are. Today's talk is something I'm super excited about. We're going to be talking about Richard's research in Richard Lewis's research in Belgium. I'm going to leave it to Richard to introduce himself, but I do have just a couple of quick notes here at the beginning. For this first hour, everybody is welcome to be here. In the last half an hour, if you are not a faculty member, we would ask politely for you to leave the room, as that's sort of our faculty mixer half hour. We'll also have some time for Q&A at the top there for those who are not faculty members who'd love to chat. Any questions you might have regarding the content or the event itself, please put them in the chat. And with that, I'm going to throw it over to Richard to introduce himself and introduce the research. But thank you all for being here again. Richard, it's up to you.
Great. Hello, everyone. This is very exciting. I've been dreaming about this day for the 5 years I was in Europe, thinking, okay, I'm taking one of my years as a sabbatical, so I have to give a presentation. And I was just fantasizing about being finished with my dissertation and at that point that I could actually just talk about it. So I'm at that point. I'm very excited. Again, my name is Richard Lewis. I'm speaking to you from the Granite Dells, the unceded territories of the Hohokam, Yavapai Apache, and I go by he, him pronouns. And so let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get on it. Okay, and I think, let's see, yes, I also put the captions on, so hopefully they will be close enough and I'll try to articulate well. My title of my talk is Selfies, Frites, and Beer, Becoming a Post-Human in Belgium. And it was kind of hard to, well, first of all, let me say that I started working at Press Ecology in 2005. And in 2016, the college was looking for faculty to take leaves. And my youngest daughter was off in college and I was like, choose me. Because I've always dreamed about being able to do my PhD and live in Europe. And so these came together. So I was very excited and I'm very thankful for the college to allow me to do this. So, let's see. Okay, so to Belgium. So 6 years ago, when the college was looking for faculty to take a leave, I started thinking about this and I had studied in the south of France. And so some people are surprised that I ended up in Belgium and not France. So because I was putting out research proposals and I actually made several arrangements in France. And thankfully, I did not end up in France for my PhD. I ended up running into my supervisor who was from Brussels and ended up doing my PhD there. And I was very, very happy to do that. I have this picture of my passport because living abroad, there's a lot of bureaucracy. And to actually get this set up, I received my visa and passport on the way to the airport. We stopped by, we actually had my mom's mail person actually meet us at the mail transit center, opened the door at 6 a.m. He went through and found my passport. that was sent from the Belgium consulate and handed it to us, and we made our way to the passport. So it was an eventful cutting it close trip, and I was off. So Belgium, for those who might not know, Belgium is a very interesting country. It's quirky and unique. It's the lower half is French speaking, the upper half is Flemish, or it's a part of Dutch speaking. And Brussels is right in the center, and that's where I was. So day one, I landed on 9/11 in 2016. And in Brussels, everything is split up in both French and Dutch. So my first meal here is in Ixelles or Elsene in Belgium. And the first thing to before I could actually have my wife and cats move over with me, I actually had to get an apartment, get insurance, get all these things. So I ended up finding an apartment and was very terrified to sign a 9-year lease. Yes, but it's renewable every 3 years. So, but it's this 9-year lease thing, and it was nice. We thought it was nice. We ended up having to break it because the people below were so loud that the floors were so thin you could hear everything, and we ended up getting out of it. But they're representing my Prescott College Muppets and having a nice meal on a very tiny balcony. It was right next to a deconsecrated church called Saint-Hubert, and it was really, really fun being there because a lot of times the door, you could kind of squeeze in and enter this. It was not supposed to be so, but I could go in there and take some pictures and explore around. My wife actually sang, and that did bring the proprietor out there, but he was just very excited to hear music being sung. So anyway, this is the halls of bureaucracy in Belgium, in our little commune called Boisfort, and spent a lot of time there trying to get, every year we'd have to renew our visa, and they kept on changing everything that you had to bring, all the paperwork you had to bring and fill out. And so it took multiple trips there, but we did discover that once we had a dog and we brought the dog with us, everything went much more smoothly. We had a big white husky, very striking dog, and they just loved him. They could not believe he wasn't a Berger Suisse, a Swiss Shepherd. But anyway. So my studies were at the VUB, the Free University of Brussels, and it was the building, the main administrative, it's called the Cigar Building, 1970s architecture, but inside it had these great staircases. And it's part of the Free University. It was started in 1834, but it was a French-speaking university, the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And in 1970, the Dutch-speaking wanted to have their own university, so they split off and made them into 2 different universities. And they're kind of still coming back together from that part. But it was strange being a French speaker, being in a Dutch-speaking university, not speaking any Dutch, and the translations, that there's this quirky Dutch English. So pretty much most of the Dutch speakers speak very, very good English, but it's just slightly different. So one of their logos, these themes of the year one of the years I was there, thinking must never submit itself. So it's right, but it's a little off. It's quite interesting. Katie, did you have a question? Okay.
No, sorry.
No problem. So I did my PhD. It was an interdisciplinary PhD, and I had 2 supervisors. One of the supervisors was part of the philosophy group, the Center of Ethics and Humanism, and my other professor was in the CIMIZO, which was Culture, Emancipation, Media, and Society. So it's really in the media and communications. And like many universities, the philosophy department's in the older, somewhat smellier building. And I could choose which one I could have my office in. And the media and communications was part of the business school. So they had the brand new office building. So I chose that. And this was a photo of many of my colleagues. We're all PhD students from all over the world. So it's pretty much everything is taught in English. There's people from China, Bolivia, Brazil, Syria, Netherlands, a few from actually Belgium itself. And I was the lone person from the US. And so again, I arrived in early September. The elections happened, and so I was the representative to say, why did this election process happen this way? And that got old very quickly, but we somewhat survived. So, and I'm trying to set this up because I was really trying to figure out, okay, do I just talk about my academics, or do I kind of share the social as well? And so I try to blend in this. So I want to talk about my research, but I'm kind of weave in some of the social and cultural things that I did as well. So my beginning research question was, how does media technology affect museum visitors' experience? And for this, on the philosophical, there's a whole, my supervisor in philosophy was really philosophy of technology. And the research was coming from a kind of a subgroup of phenomenology called post-phenomenology. And they really look specifically at technological relations. And so this was really my foundational approach to getting into this. And post-phenomenology really looks at this idea of non-neutrality of mediating technological relations. And they use this formula I, technology world. So the person is mediated by technology in between as they perceive and engage with the world. And what this non-neutral relations with technology kind of looks like, it's kind of on one end, you have this fantasy of complete agency where technology is simply an instrument. We contain all of our free will, and we just simply use technology to extend our abilities. And this is a kind of an instrumental approach. And on the other end is this fear of technology, that we don't have any agency, right? That technology is this huge thing that determines our existence. And really where post-phenomenology and post-humanism land is right in between this, that trying to get away from these binaries, that there's actually what's called a shared agency. And this is a relational approach to technology. And post-phenomenology uses four main relations. There's others depending on who you talk to, but the four primary ones are an embodied approach. So this is where glasses, right? We see through our technology and we perceive the world, engage with the world through our technology. The technology itself kind of disappears into the background, and it just enhances our ability to engage with the world, like glasses. Another relation is called hermeneutic, and that is like a thermometer where we're reading technology to get an idea of the world. And then there's also the alterity, where you have the technology is a quasi-other. So this is where you have these therapy, artificial intelligent, robotic machine dogs that are being used especially in retirement homes and things as a way to engage with. And then you have background technologies, HVAC systems, technologies that are happening, but we don't really pay much attention to them unless they break. So those are the four main groupings of technological relations. And to explore this, what I did is one of the first things, like 3 or 4 months in, it was in January 2017, there's a thing called Museum Selfie Day. And I thought, hey, this is a perfect time to take these post-phenomenological relations and try to experience them for myself. So I was working on the theory, learning the theory, but it's, let's put this into practice and let me try to experience this and what is it like? So I went to there was a ukiyo-e exhibit at the Cinquantenaire Museum in Brussels. And I went there to take museum selfies and experience this. And I figured I would be really looking at two primary technological relations. The embodied, so I would be taking selfies, I would be seeing through the technology myself and kind of situating in my creation of a museum selfie. So I'd be using this technology to see through. And then also the hermeneutic relation. So after in selfies are shared oftentimes on social media, and they're part of a construction of self through self images and so they're read. So you can actually see, you can understand them through this hermeneutic relation as we're reading the selfie as a construction of myself with my social group. And so these were the two primary relations that I was expecting to experience when I went to take the museum selfie. Well, when I got there, it was crowded. There were people everywhere, and not being a long-term selfie taker, I was quite neurotic about trying to take this selfie in front of all these people. I mean, they were everywhere. And so this selfie, museum selfie, it was a really nice capture of capturing the chaos that I was feeling. So I was taking this around the vitrine, the museum vitrine, the window, the glass case, and it really kind of like a cubist, surrealist type of. I was really happy with this because it really captured what I was feeling, because I was very nervous about trying to take selfies in front of people. And so what this kind of brought to my attention is the situatedness of technologies, that we can't really simply look at technological relations and separate them from the broader context. And what I really was starting to understand better is that in the field of post-phenomenology, that they're very technocentric, right? It's really the technological relations is their primary lens for seeing everything. And I felt a real need to expand that approach. And so, one of my experience, I wrote about it in my dissertation, about turning our back on art, our post-phenomenological study of museum selfies, which was kind of fun to write. So I tried to expand my horizons, and basically I just kept on asking myself, what is the most interesting thing I can think about? And there was a kind of the double-edged sword of not being funded. So I tried to get funding when I was there. I tried several times. I came close a couple times, but in the end, never got an official funding, which allowed me to really focus on whatever I wanted. And what I really started being fascinated with is this human technology convergence, and this idea that we are becoming more and more, technologies are really physically as well as algorithmically and software really merging, are becoming inseparable from who we are as humans. And so this is kind of this what's called neural dust. It's a way to activate a neural connection. And so I kept on asking, what is human, right? And I started exploring this whole concept of NBIC technologies. This is the nano, bio, informational, and cognitive science technologies. And this really started in 2003. This really with a Congress in Washington, D.C., there was a group that really started getting together to really look at this issue. And then all of a sudden, this whole CRISPR-Cas9 came out. So all of a sudden, we have this easy ability, inexpensive ability to actually genetically modify ourselves. And that was released into the world. And so it's looking at using technology to increase our longevity. And there's, from the transhumanist side, there's this even idea, if you go to the extreme of being able to upload our minds into machines and potentially live forever. And this is way down the rabbit hole of transhumanism. And so I really started kind of investigating that. And one of my first conference presentations was on, because it was all about the Anthropocene at that time, that was just coming out. Hello, Anthropocene, goodbye, humanity. And trying to find an approach with transhumanists that might be a little bit more acceptable. But I guess I dove really into the ideas of humanism, where that are situated in the 18th century Enlightenment, the rational humanist, which is kind of encapsulated by Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. Transhumanists who take that and try to merge technology to become the best possible human and potentially become what might be even post-human, something beyond what we know as the human species. And then I came across kind of post-humanism, and post-humanism coming from critical post-humanism and philosophical post-humanism coming from Rosie Braidotti and the like. And so first, I'll just kind of touch briefly on transhumanists. They're very forward-thinking, they're very affirmative, and think a lot of good things can happen with technology. But they're really connected and tied to this idea of the rational humanism and the Enlightenment. They really support the ideas of technology, using technology to improve human lives. The issues I've had with transhumanism is it tends to be very overly dramatic. It's very sci-fi, and all the images, you do a Google image search for transhumanism and you'll get images like this, where it's just this fantastical sci-fi and a lot of money behind it in transhumanism. And they really look into life extensions, mind uploading, this thing called super intelligence. One of the, I think, stumbling blocks is the beginnings of transhumanism really had these very strong libertarian beginnings, very ultra individualist. That's changed over time. This was in the 80s and early 90s. And since then, there's been more and more kind of social democrats that have been part of transhumanist movement. And they're trying to tone down the kind of the individual voice and realizing we need to look at this more broadly and make sure all of society has access to improving our lifestyle. Another thing, as I've participated in a lot of conferences, in the transhumanist conferences, it's like 90% male. It's this gender divide is quite fascinating versus attending a post-humanist conference where it's probably 75% female. So it's interesting seeing all these, being able to play in these different kind of fields of study and see what they're like. It was a fantastic learning experience. So luckily, I feel that transhumanists have really started, instead of being very just uncritically thinking, technologically supportive approach, they're actually really looking at some existential threats that technology, merging with technology, can come up with. They're, like Max Moore's, saying that the simplified, unified self has been replaced by the far more complex and puzzling self revealed by the neurosciences. And they're starting to more and more understand that we're interconnected, but it still has a, and James Hughes, one of the transhumanists, points out that it's still this tension because it's tied to this idea of the individual and a very strong individual being separate. And then there's the singularity. So the singularity, just as an aside and a rabbit hole we won't go too far down, but it's a really fun rabbit hole to look into. So it's the idea that once we create let's say an artificial intelligence, an artificial general intelligence, a machine that is smarter than ourselves, then that machine could create a machine even smarter than it. And so it's this point of being able to really advance the superintelligence and grow far beyond human capabilities. So we're as humans, and this is a big assumption, if we are kind of at the apex of intelligence life on the world, that's, I'd say, a question. But the singularity with machines and what's called an artificial general intelligence would be very clearly, we would no longer be the smartest. And this has really fun philosophical ideas and concepts to think about. And so one of the things that I think transhumanists like to talk about mind uploading is so that we're not left behind. So if we can actually be a part of that singularity, right? If we can kind of merge with that artificial general intelligence somehow, then we will be led into this what's called a post-human, meaning no longer human species, right? So Homo technologicus. Okay, let's move away from transhumanism. It's always just taught a class in media ecology, and we had great conversations because it's probably one of the most fun things to think about, a lot of these transhumanist ideas. So going into post-human. So again, like I mentioned, transhumanist, post-human refers to something beyond what we can understand as human. In critical and philosophical post-humanism, it's using the term post-human as a better way of understanding who we actually are and have always been. Post-humanists really push back on this humanist ideal and point out very critically that so many people, so many marginalized groups have never counted as human. And so they try to use the word post-human to kind of move away from humanism, because humanism is this really sticky concept. And in its ideal form, okay, it can be good, but in reality, it's led to a lot of issues, Holocaust, eugenics, things like that. So some of the critical post-humanist writers I've really gotten into, like Rosie Braidotti, Donna Haraway, it really has emerged out of feminism and post-colonialism, and really looking at the human and trying to decenter the human from all things. It situates the human with this complex non-anthropocentric framework. And so what Ferrando points out, and I like this way of understanding what the post-human is, it's kind of three different aspects. One, it's trying to distance ourselves from the origins of humanism. It's trying to become post-anthropocentric, meaning moving the human out of the center of all things and in this exceptional position. And really this post-dualist, trying to get away from binaries, right? Rosie Braidotti always says it's and, not either or. So trying to give us these false binaries of you have to choose one or the other, and trying to really have a more affirmative and inclusive approach. Complexity theory, I won't talk too much about complexity theory, but it's really the foundation of my whole dissertation is the idea that we are complex living systems. And so this moves away from kind of the Newtonian mechanics, these causal relations, and that we are more as an environment or an ecosystem as a living system. And it's also the idea that we're always human becomings. We are constantly being constituted by our technological and other relations. And one of the books I really like, Tim Ingold in biological anthropology, talks about the biosocial becomings. So this idea that we should consider ourselves as human becomings. We're not these static, standalone individuals that the humanist approach is, but we're always emerging. So I kind of boiled this down to really needing to redefine what the individual is, and that existence is not this individual affair. We do not pre-exist our interactions. Rather, we emerge through and part of their entangled intro-relating. And if I could suggest one book everybody should be reading is Karen Barad's Meeting the Universe Halfway. She's a quantum physicist and a post-humanist, and really plays with this idea of understanding ourselves better through, I'd say, quantum properties and complexity. So typewriters, I love typewriters. I got into typewriters, manual typewriters, and I have a typewriter right here on my desk. I don't know if you can see that, from Vienna. Anyway, I am a different writer on my typewriter than on my laptop. And I had this media ecology class I just taught, and one of my students actually borrowed a typewriter and started writing a screenplay, and just said he fell back in love with writing because it was just this different experience, and it was forced him to slow down and really internalize the story a lot better. And it sparked joy by going through this process. I just love that. He got an A. Anyway, so really the idea is moving from autonomy to relationality and blurring the boundaries of this individual self, right? So this idea that, okay, our microbiomes, we have in the biological microbes in our system, we have about just as many cells that are part of the microbiome that make up our human body. So where is this self? Where can we point to? Where's the boundaries of this self? And really trying to blur that and understand that the self is this tied into this interrelationality, that we are always beings in relation, and we're becoming and transforming through our different relations that we have in our life. Andrew Pickering calls this the dance of agency, which I love the term, right? Instead of saying, okay, do humans have free will? Instead looking at, okay, we have agency, we have free will, but so do objects. Objects have agency and they affect us. And we are constituted when both these agencies come together. So one of the things I really tried to do is, I'm a visual learner. So I wanted to try to create a visual that represented this, that moved from the Vitruvian Man of Leonardo da Vinci to something that, and I would say what Karen Barad talks about is interaction, that a phenomenon is when we as a subject are in relation. And I use the Greek deltas, which is a mathematical system meaning change. So we change, we become, or we're constituted when we become in relation with something. And so that's kind of that's the foundational building block of my dissertation, is this idea of a better understanding of what we are as humans. And then I had an epiphany Christmas Eve, the night before Christmas. And yes, I have typewriters, so I made a typewriter tree. And this was like a year and a half in, and it just struck me, this idea that, and it took me a long time. Okay, you can have an epiphany, that's all well and good, but to actually articulate it is a struggle. Trying to capture this epiphany with words took me forever. And it took me really another probably year and a half to really finalize it. But it started with this idea that what I was calling, and I was focusing specifically on technology, is that we have this technological sense or a gaze through which we interact with the world, and our experiences with these technologies creates this lens through which we interact with the world. And so I warn you, there's a neologism ahead. This is my one thing that I put together to try to capture this, because I wasn't completely happy with technological gaze or technological sense, and I wanted to kind of describe it differently. And so I described it as intrasubjective mediation. And I know this, it's a bit of a stopper. You have to kind of pause and say, what the heck are you talking about? And I realized as I was trying to work through this, I finally came upon a paragraph in Don Idey's book that he says, technologies transform our experience of the world, and we in turn become transformed in this process. And then he adds, these transformations are non-neutral. And this was the seed that I had read, like the first couple months I was there, I'd read these words. I didn't remember reading them, but I think this was the seed that was planted that kind of led me into this idea of intersubjective mediation. And it's really using it as a tool to investigate ourselves, right? So by understanding intersubjective mediation, we can actually look at how we are transformed by all our relations, and how these transformations then change our perception and our engagement with the world. And so I built basically everything on this idea. And so intersubjective mediation reflects how we perceive and engage with the world through the transformations from all of our various changing relations. And by using these ideas, by becoming aware of them, we can then better choose how to critically engage with technology. And so my idea, my approach was, first, we need to understand our relations with technology. We have to become aware and as clearly as possible to understand them before we can then judge them. Are these good relations? Is this a good technology that belongs in my life? How can I regain some agency? And so the first part of that is awareness or education. And then we can get into the critical aspect. And so what this intersubjective mediation leverages is this embodied relation. Just like I said at the beginning, one of the 4 technological relations that we perceive through technology to the world, we're perceiving through our transformations, and we engage with the world through those. So one of the conferences I participated in is in Paris. It was talking about the perception and the inhuman gaze. It was a phenomenology conference. And Rosie Braidotti and I were both on a panel. We were kind of the anomalies. Everybody else was a strong phenomenologist. And we were like, okay, we kind of relate to phenomenology, but we don't consider ourselves phenomenologists. And I actually have a chapter in this book called The Technological Gaze. So understanding how technologies transform our perception, and understanding how once we're transformed, these changes continue to mediate us into the future. So that was a lot of, so that's kind of the first half of my research. This was kind of, I was really wallowing in all this. And then starting year 3, my supervisors both said, okay, these are great grand theories, really interesting, but you need to find something specific. You need to narrow it down. And they suggested using media literacy, because media literacy is also about education, understanding media relations. And so I started to frame it, my research with media literacy. And so I situated the media literacy within first looking at the medium, and this is through a media ecology lens, the context, the broader context, socio-cultural context, and this idea that we are post-human subjects, that we are always emergent. And so this was kind of the coming together of my research. I watched the time. Oh my goodness. Okay, good. So I played with both media literacy and media ecology. And I was really looking at photography and selfies to look at this. And one of the things I really like about media ecology, it looks at the mediums, right? It's not just the content, but the actual medium itself, whether it's print, books, television, social media, Twitter. It looks at how do those mediums affect us? And it's really looking at, so as media as environments. And one of the things I really liked, and this is this idea of the Gutenberg parenthesis. So media ecologists like to look very, very broadly at the wide picture. And they look at, okay, from when we were in an oral tradition versus a print tradition to moving into a digital tradition. And this is where it tied into my master's work in trying to understand how does the digital medium change how we can move knowledge through time? How can we transmit knowledge? And that this whole parenthesis of this from the Gutenberg print really changed how we communicate, and where this idea, once you put something in print, it becomes stable. It's a way of externalizing knowledge, and knowledge is not externalized in an oral tradition. It's shared. And in a digital network, it's networked. Anyway, I think I need to move. I'll move a little bit more quickly through this because I'm running out of some time. And so I brought this up, and I went to a bunch of different conferences, one in Iceland where my mom came and joined me. It was brilliant. She was 82 at the time. We drove around the whole island, got to explore Iceland in March, which is incredibly dramatic and just phenomenal for a photographer. And then like a week and a half later, I was in Helsinki at a photomedia conference, and I took the traditional sauna and then jumped into this saltwater pool that's part of the bay where they have to break the ice out. It was incredibly cold experience. And I use these conferences. So one of the things in the doctoral programs in Europe, they tend to be less structured. There's not a lot of classes. So what I did is I used conferences to give myself some structure that I could try to bring something together, bring ideas together. So I did many conferences over the 4 years I was there, which was a lot of fun. And just to kind of mix things up, this is from our back porch in Belgium. So where we lived was on the very edge of the town of the city of Brussels, and we had is a good thing. It forces you to move forward. And so January 1st, I had bought this typewriter at a little local flea market a couple of years before. And I decided to start January 1st, sit down at this typewriter and start typing up my dissertation, to use it as an experience to engage writing through this media, because I was really looking at technological relations and how they constitute myself, and how am I different while I'm typing on this computer, this typewriter versus a laptop. And so these were my beginning words. And I immediately discovered that the typewriter didn't have any margin stops. All the keys were plugged, so you couldn't tell the difference between a C and an E and an O. So there needed to be a lot of work done, but it was actually quite easy to do work on that. And anyway, it started a love affair with old mechanical typewriters. So then, as I was writing, I am putting and really getting my dissertation into form. I really needed to try to create this. I wanted to create a really simple framework to capture these ideas, so I could keep tethered to this broad perspective. So I was playing around with these ideas, these different groupings of relations. So we had technology, but as I discovered in my museum selfie experience, socio-cultural relations were also right there in my face. There's also the idea of temporal relations and proximity, right? Space, time and space were very important. So this was kind of some of the starting figures that I was starting to put together. And I eventually came to this framework, which was a simple relational framework, and where the mind and body with the little delta symbol that I'd created, where the mind and body were kind of near the center, with an underlying time space below that, and socio-cultural relations and technological relations above that. And I use that to, and I did not want these boundaries in between these different groupings to be boundaries of identity, of separation, and instead more like what Fritz of Capra was saying, these are boundaries of identity, right? So it's an instrument for us to use to seek out what are the technological relations, what are the sociocultural relations, and understand that they're all interconnected. And on top of that, there's unknown and unknowable relations. So making sure that there's a placeholder, that we can't know everything. We don't know everything that's affecting us. But this is just a start in being able to explore this. And because these groups are very broad and inclusive, there's an ability to create subgroups. So in the mind, we can actually look at imagination, awareness, identity, sociocultural relations. We can look at normativity, issues of power and politics, language, and in temporal relations, time, future, past. And so I was happy with that, but how do we make it pragmatic? How do we make it, like for media literacy, how can we put this theory into praxis? And I wanted to develop this instrument that would allow students to engage with this and seek out these relations. And so what I did is I returned once again to that initial museum selfie day, and it was really shocking to realize how much of my dissertation was wrapped up in this museum selfie, that I thought it was just kind of this one-off experience, but it just kind of, it echoed through my 4 years, which was all right. So what I did is I went back to that time and I looked at, okay, what were all the relations that could be contained in that grouping of mind relations? And not only that, how much did each of those relations affect me at the time? So this one here, my interest in following the curatorial information, the museum curators curated this experience. It didn't really affect me. I was trying to do my own thing. It definitely nudged me a little bit, but it wasn't a big effect. However, my intention, my relation trying to see museum objects and imagine possible selfies, that affected me quite a bit. And so I just try to do an easy 3-2-1 differentiation on the effect. And then I looked into all 6 of these groupings of relations and did the same thing. So temporality, how's my own experience taking selfies with my phone affect me? My past experience as a photographer, how did that affect me? So those were relations that were also occurring. And I did this for each of the groupings of relations. But then I realized, well, I couldn't really separate, because this idea of, okay, how was I paying attention to the curator and being in a museum? Well, that was also tied to the socio-cultural relations, my own upbringing, my own culture, my own experience. So we had each group affecting each group. And so I expanded this and I put another column to the right of all these. And so for each relation, I could say, okay, how are these other relations affecting that experience? And I could expand that out. And this became, my supervisors really got excited about this, because especially for media literacy, this is like, oh, this is a very practical thing students could do. They could take this and they could engage with some sort of media, and they could start to analyze it rather than just this broad, simple framework that's more theoretical. And what it does is it shows this complexity of interrelations behind that experience, that museum selfie in my case. And this is what I went, and when I did a postdoc in France, I taught a bunch of master students, or a few master students, this, and had them run through it. And then I just did it in this last block as well with my media ecology class. And it was quite effective. I was quite happy with that. All right, wow, we're already nearing the end of the time, and we just got to my public defense. So the public defense happened 9/11/2020, exactly 4 years after I landed in Brussels. And instead of coming back to the US, which is what I was planning on doing, the pandemic hit. And so we had to make other plans. And I ended up doing a postdoc in France. And because it's 4:56, I'll need to just kind of show you a couple pictures. So it's northern France in a town called Lille. And so it's about an hour and 30 minutes driving. It's 42 minutes by train, the high-speed train. And this is where Lille is. It's very, very northern part of France, where I got a car, we got a little farmhouse. We lived on the edge of this farm, literally 3 feet from the farm fields where the tractors would come. And on the left there, yes, is a bottle of whiskey that I was given after my public defense. But on the right, that's not a bottle. This was something that we discovered living in the French Flanders. And this was the hub of World War I. And the town we lived in was all but one building was completely destroyed. And on the right here are something that I pulled out of a ditch after my wife pointed it out. And it ended up being an unexploded bomb from World War I. So it was about 102 years old. And that I looked down and was in my hand. This was a interesting experience, to say the least. But we found these all over. Here's a 120 millimeter shell and this is our farmhouse that we just came across. and that was just kind of laying in the shell. And we had walks, there's all these bunkers all around. And so it's known as the iron harvest, where tractors are always pulling up these mostly exploded, thankfully, shells, but they do find about 900 tons a year of unexploded shells from both the wars. And I did bring a few back with me. Here's various things we pulled out of the ground, from fuses to, so this was I had no idea that this came as a very sobering, very interesting and culturally significant experience, that being from the US, where we haven't had battles on our soil in this type. We've had other battles, and I live in the Dells, where the Yavapai Apache, when we had Fort Whipple right near, so we had other issues as well. But this was quite interesting, and I think but it was also incredibly beautiful. There's the hops that were being raised, and the landscape itself was just simply incredible. And I'm at 5 o'clock, so I think I need to probably stop and open up for questions and see if there's any questions that are out there that I could answer quickly before we go into, I think there's the faculty part as well.
Yep.
So
thank you so much for that, Richard. First of all, if there are things you left out that you want to go back to, feel free to take that time. I think everybody is willing to let you have that time, because that was super exciting and interesting. And that the right at that end part is where I was really desperate for more. With that, if you have any questions, people, you can put them in the chat. We'll spend a couple of minutes for those who are not faculty members, if there are any here asking, and then we'll ask in a few minutes for everybody who's not faculty to leave and everybody else to stay around. So thank you so much, and remember, you can put them in the chat.
Oh, and I didn't even show you, so that there's, okay, we'll take a little tour. Because the interesting thing, because I did mention beer, and so one of the things, these are our various different beer glasses that came back from Belgium. So in Brussels, you order a beer and it comes in its own glass. So this is La Corne, which it actually has a hangman's noose on it. It comes from the Ardennes down in Wallonia. And it was in a region where they actually had a local hangman, and it was like known for that for some reason. Anyway, but when I first went over to my supervisor's house, he asked me if I wanted a beer, and he said, okay, first you need to choose your glass. And from then he will find the right beer that goes in that glass. So most bars, you order a specific type of beer. Let's say you order a vedette, and you'll get the vedette glass that comes with it. Just a funny little interesting cultural aspect.
I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. Well, there's no questions right now from non-faculty, so in the interest of wanting to save time for faculty to ask their questions, we're going to ask any non-faculty members to say goodbye. Thank you for being here. I do have one question for you, Richard, just because I think it's really, I don't know, I'm really interested in the ways in which we connect the research that we do and then how we talk to people about that research. And I'm wondering how you brought your experience in Belgium back to your students at both at Prescott College and elsewhere as you do this media ecology work. How have you talked to your students about this work?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's what I found. So the education in Europe, there's a lot of differences from the PhD program and the type of education. And it was interesting because when I taught the master's students, the administration came back to me after I turned in my grades and said, why are all your students doing so well? You know, you just gave a bunch of good grades. And I was told, so in their 20 is top, and you can't give anybody a 20, right? So you just can't. It's illegal culturally. So the top grade is 19. And my scores range from 16 to 19 that I gave my students. And they said, you know, this is unheard of. You cannot, you know, these students aren't that good. You know, it's impossible. And so I walked them through. I gave them examples. It's like, okay, my class was actually a class for, as much for me, trying to run a usability study of my post-human approach, right? And I was running all my students through it. And I had to have their feedback, and I could not let them not engage. And so there were a couple students who like would have been the students who just didn't really interact and just kind of turned in some really not sufficient work. But I would just contact them and work with them to force them to engage with the work. And so to make sure that they understood it, because I was learning in my instructions what wasn't working to them. And so it was as much for me as for the students. And so it was this more, I'd say, Prescott College type of engagement with their students, and kind of a one-to-one, really close relationship that isn't typical in Europe, especially not typical in French academics, where until you have a PhD, you are nothing. Even as a PhD student, you are nothing. It's only once you get that magical PhD that you are a colleague. Luckily, Belgium was not like that. Belgium, as a PhD student, you are a colleague. And we worked very closely with the professors, which is why I'm so happy to be in Belgium and not France for doing my PhD work.
Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions from the faculty members who are here, from those of you who are here? I know that it's a snow day there, so.
Rich, I'm sorry I came in so late. I was teaching.
Oh, those pesky students.
So all I caught was the end with the amazing looking tool with all the colors and the numbers, but I did not catch enough of it to ask a remotely intelligent question.
That's okay. I like your instruments on your wall behind you.
Oh, thank you. They're not mine.
They're still nice.
Richard, I'm curious, you mentioned wanting to go to Europe to do your PhD studies, and I'm wondering what that process was of just, you know, going through that process of applying and trying to get to Europe more. You spoke a little bit of that at the beginning, but I'm truly curious about that.
Right. Oh, that was a process. And each country, I mean, you have the EU, right? And you have this fantasy that, oh, the EU is like this kind of homogenous, they all work together and have all these agreements. It's like being in the United States, and it's the states instead of, right? But it's not like that. No, every country has its own bureaucracies, and they don't interact. Just selling my car. So in Belgium, the license plate stays with the person, but in France, the license plate stays with the car. And it took 3 months to sell the car and get it actually off my stuff from Belgium into France, into the person who bought it. And yeah, so France has a whole, actually has a pretty good mechanism to explore different doctoral programs in different fields of study, and they're all labeled. So 71 71 is communications, and I eventually was able to connect and send out a bunch of emails to different faculty to try to find a faculty that was a good fit for what my ideas, what kind of working with media and museums and looking at media technology and how they affected museum visitor experience. But it was always, even, I mean, I actually went over to France and I talked to some of the faculty, and there was always this disconnect. There was always something I was missing. And I actually interviewed and did a presentation in front of 25 heads of faculty, French faculty, which was the most horrible experience I've ever had in my academic life, because they were asking me these questions. And I understood their words, but I didn't understand the cultural context beneath their words. And it was clear they were meaning something very specific that I wasn't getting. And so it was like, and it ended up really being that they have this very, 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 very strong cultural history that you must stay within. And versus why the Free University of Brussels, where I did my dissertation, was so opening to me, and like the heavens parted, and I was like, oh, saved by this approach, because the Free University is trying to get outside the connections with the church at that time, back in 1870 when it started. And it was the freedom of thought against these more strict parameters, versus in France, it's still, well, I was at a Catholic university for my postdoc. I mean, it's still quite ingrained, maybe not specifically Catholic, but I'd say the essence, or there's a residue that's still left over. And it's really about protecting the French culture, which when you're in France gives you this very strong idea of French culture. And it feels, as a tourist, it's great because it's this really unique experience, and it's strong and it's very identifiable, versus you go to Brussels and it's a mess. It's hundreds of cultures all melting together and being weird, and it's so lovely. It's so refreshing and inclusive. But this is Brussels itself, not Belgium as a whole, because Belgium as a whole, you still, in Flanders in the north, very conservative, still get a very right wing type of approach there, trying to keep the Flemish nationalist ideals in place against the Walloons in the south, who are French speaking and are really try to consider themselves a subset of France, though France does not consider them anywhere near France because they are not French. So it's there's so I mean, okay, I was studying philosophy of technology and media and communications, and I was learning so much from that. But the social and cultural nuances were just so refreshing. And Brussels, it was this, I keep on saying quirky because, I mean, so the mannequin piss is this little tiny statue that's about, I don't know, 8 inches high. And I mean, that's kind of this national symbol. Everybody kind of conglomerates and watches this little boy peeing out of this fountain, and it's like really celebrated. There's a museum for all the different outfits he wears. I mean, so the Belgians don't take themselves seriously. I mean, they like to have a lot of fun. The Belgian government like was shut down for 3 years. It didn't work. They couldn't find a quorum, so everything went just fine, because all rather than like our government, if it shuts down, a huge portion of our population don't get paychecks. There, everything just worked fine, and you have everything's kind of run at the commune level, the little tiny towns, and you have all these very small governments that are collaborated together but separated by language. So you have a whole Dutch-speaking educational system that is completely separate than the French-speaking educational system, which is completely separate than the German-speaking educational system. And then everybody speaks English as well. So, you know, trilingualism is the norm in Belgium. It's just so refreshing coming from the US, where for me, my biggest shock when I studied abroad as an undergraduate in the south of France and coming back was how uninternationally minded we are as a US as a whole. And which is, I mean, Europe is messy. Brussels is messy. I mean, the EU is messy, but it's interesting. And it's not trying to have this purity or this semblance of unification, which means we're not all the same. And its basis is we are all different and we're all in this together and we're trying to make it work. And that is so refreshing, even though it's so messy. Like transportation is messy. It's not easy. Anyway, so it's one of the things in post-phenomenology is understanding that every new thing, every new technology or whatever, every system always enables and always constrains. And so it's, whereas marketers always try to show what is the benefit and what this adds, post-phenomenology is always looking at these backgrounded relations that are hidden, that are nudging us and affecting us. And so this is, for my approach, is trying to bring these backgrounded relations into our understanding so we can tease the whole situation apart a little bit and see all the complex interrelationality a little bit more clearly, and then go from there to figure out, okay, now let's criticize it. Is this good for me? Is this good for my life world? How do I want to engage with social media? And this is what I did with my students. Their last experience in the media ecology class was to use a slow media for a week. And how was that? And they all across the board were like, I am much happier. Right. So it wasn't just giving up social media. It wasn't just reducing their screen time. It was replacing that with a slow media, either working on typewriter, creating paper, doing song work, doing something besides streaming YouTube videos or posting on Facebook and Instagram and all that. They still did it a little bit, but they reduced it dramatically. And I think that's the key. It was, and what I learned in teaching this last media ecology class was it's not just my approach, which helps them understand a media relation, but then following that up with an actual kind of a week-long different experience, right, where they do this slow media, which is Jennifer Rausch's book, which is brilliant. It's based off of the slow food movement. And she uses that to look at trying to create a slow media, not trying to give up media. You know, it's part of us, but trying to take back some of our agency. And that's, I guess, the goal of my whole dissertation is trying to set this up so we can get to the point of deciding to take back some of our agency.
That seems really pertinent right now, given there's still time for other faculty questions, and if they don't come in, we can end in a minute, but I just want to say, like, seems really pertinent right now, given like the Instagram influencer economy that brought in like something like $100 million last year, that we're being sold to so much. And the social media that we spend the most amount of time on, things like Twitter and Instagram, are also the ones that are most tied to like people having negative emotional reactions to what they get on social media.
Right.
You know, so it just seems really pertinent that like taking back control, slow media, like it's not about doing it away, but it is about having a sense of agency in how we make decisions around what we consume.
Right. And so in my media ecology class, right before the last week, we watched The Social Dilemma. which is kind of the low point, right? This is the ugliest thing that we can open our eyes to and understand how we are the product, right? The customer in social media are the advertisers. And if you haven't watched The Social Dilemma, it's brilliant. It's horrible it's really hard because it shows us the underlying issue is the business model. That's the attention economy. And so to grab people's attention, algorithms force and create these bubbles and give the most spectacular, to the top, right? The most divisive, the most outrageous rises to the top of the algorithms. And so that's what we see. And this is our starting point. This is what I was telling my class. It's like, okay, this is what's happening right now. We can't go backwards. Time is, we can't go backwards. So how do we change? Who's going to either create parameters or policies around what business models can do, or create a new business model? There has to be a way to make this better.
That's super interesting. I used to teach media studies before the internet started producing us. The attention economy, I haven't heard of that before, but I certainly know that newspapers also produced audiences for advertisers, right? Not necessarily using algorithms, but and newspapers weren't free, but they were darn cheap, right? Like they weren't making the money off the 25 cents that you spent for the New York Times. Right. But that, it's capital, like it's a profit-driven business model, I guess you would call it, or political economy. So what are the alternatives to that? I mean, I remember, when the internet was supposed to be this revolutionary freeing thing.
It was for 4.5 years.
4.5 exactly. That's super.
I don't know. It's somewhere in there, from 1998 to, I don't know, maybe after 2005, then it started getting dark, right? It's where it was very empowering, and this bottom-up process where it gave voice to the marginalized groups. It allowed us to come together, but then the whole thing as the internet moved forward is we needed to figure out how to make money. The companies needed to figure out how to make money, right? So people became the producers, right? We're called prosumers now. We're producers and consumers at the same time. Mm-hmm. We aren't getting paid for that. In fact, we are paying. I mean, it's like the academic publishing model now, right? Yeah. So so I love media ecology. It's so much fun because we looked at, okay, how did the Telegraph do the same thing? Mm-hmm. The Telegraph made it so we became interested in what the princess was wearing at her wedding over in the UK, right? And it's like, why? It trivialized, right? The news became very trivialized. Mm-hmm. Though at the same time, I'd say newspapers, being, the fourth estate, trying to keep governments in check, had a role to play that now, and again, watch The Social Dilemma, or there's also this new journal, well, not new anymore, called Delayed Gratification. It's out of the UK, and there's a TED Talk by the guy who started it. And he talks about, and in Jennifer Rausch's book, Slow Media, she talks about journalism specifically as well, and how social media and the immediacy that everything you only have currency if you're the first to report it. Mm-hmm. Only the first 4 top Google hits are the ones who make money. Mm-hmm. Nobody else does. So it talks about, he brings up, it's like for, I don't know, 6 minutes there was a false, like the journalists write up 2 reports and they're waiting for the judge's decision on the trial. And once the judge said guilty, they pushed the guilty one and it was published.
Mhm.
But in this scenario, it was the judge said this person was guilty of a lesser affair, a lesser thing, but not guilty over the big one, which is, so for 4 or 5 minutes, that up on the #1 internet English speaking website, news website, it had this whole thing with quotes about the person breaking down in tears and all these specific experiences that didn't happen, but they had to be first. And so it's changed journalism dramatically. So this journal called Delayed Gratification, its taglines, yesterday's news tomorrow. And what they do is they wait, they go back and they say, okay, this is what happened in the last 3 months. And they go back to these places which were the hotspots of news organizations, of the news media that were there in the limelight for 2 days, and then they left, mine collapse or whatever. They go back and they do the in-depth reporting and figure out what happened to that culture, that community, what are the ins and outs, and then they report it later in a full-blown investigative reporting. And so it's this slow journalism movement as well, which again, that's exciting. We can't, and I think it's finding balance, right? It's not, and again, it's not this either or, it's and. And so the currency of journalism is always going to be there. First is always going to be very, very, very important. But how do we support this deeper, especially so critically necessary for democracy, the fourth estate? Anyway.
Totally. No, I think I'm curious about, there's the various different capitalist business models for journalism, for the news, that, develop as you've just been describing, with the development of new technologies. And then there's there's state-owned media, right, which can be extremely antithetical to the democratic role, the supposedly democratic role of journalism, which I do. I was raised by investigative journalists, so I still believe in that. But what about, and I mean, PBS is PBS, but what are the other, I guess my question is, like, what are the other business models, right? There's like public ownership or there's private ownership, but I'm super interested in journalism. I mean, like radio, right? Which is an old technology, but still lots of people listen to the radio.
Absolutely. And it's that whole where the term broadcasting came from, right? Because it's just like from agroecology, that's the sending it out massively like that. And it's created all these revolutions. And there was just in one NPR show, they're talking about cassette tapes and how cassette tapes completely changed cultures because it allowed people to record and send them and share when they couldn't do radio. And it's so why I love media ecology is because we kind of look into these different mediums and investigate how they've affected change, and it's really looking at within these mediums. This is within the medium is where culture grows. Just like in a petri dish, it's called a media, right? You put the agar, it's a media, and you grow cultures on that. It's exactly the same thing. So television grew a culture out of television, and in a very specific way. Radio, the same. When the telegraph came, it changed everything. Up until the telegraph, you could only communicate as fast as a horse or a ship could travel. That was as fast as you could do it. And all of a sudden, with the telegraph, you could understand what happened in China in 4 hours in the UK.
Right.
And this just fundamentally changed culture.
Yeah. I'm so sorry. I have to let somebody in the house. I will be right back.
Okay. Well, I think we're almost out of time too.
I think we're at 6:30. I got to tell you, as a journalist, I love hearing this stuff since I actually run a community news organization. And when we got started, we were on the cutting edge of these discussions. We used to hack old Nokia phones before they even had cameras, just
Mhm.
live stream from them.
Mhm.
So this is all really interesting for me. And now we've stepped back, and now it's like podcasting and newsletters and things that you have to consume differently than live stream or some of the more newer technologies.
Yep, my colleague, he was Syrian, that I worked with in Belgium, and his part was looking at um, the alternative news medias that were located outside of Syria because they had to leave, right? And they were in Istanbul. So he actually went and worked in Istanbul in a news organization for like 4 weeks, 4 months or something. Really interesting, really interesting, because it's yeah, this what is the role of journalists? How can they communicate when a dictator kicks them all out, right? And you have a blackout and you can't. Anyway, it's we're in a very interesting time. The old Chinese curse.
Yeah, definitely a curse. Um, well, thank you so much, Richard, for doing this. This was really thrilling. I'm very excited. I wish more people could have been here. I'm sure the snow impacted things at least a little bit. God knows, every time we get snow this year, we've had internet issues. It's been a real challenge with having to operate on Zoom. But with that, this has been recorded, and I'm just so grateful that you were here, and it will go up, and we'll make sure to share it out far and wide for folks to watch.
Great. Oh, I have to represent my Belgium national football team.
Thank you.
Belgium Red Devils.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
Great with everybody. Nice to see everyone.
Nice to see you all.
Bye-bye.